This video is a demo of one of the many tutorials you can find in the 3D coloring book, a course specifically designed to help you master Substance Painter. If you want to gain full access to this tutorial and unlock more tutorials and free assets, click the link in the description.
One of 500 birds that are being judged today at the show.
So, you want to learn stylized PBR texturing in Substance Painter. Of course, you're already a sophisticated and intelligent person, so you've most likely enrolled into the 3D coloring book, where you have access to tons of tutorials and hundreds of pre-made assets, and you've now gone on there and downloaded yourself a cute little rooster who's waiting to be textured. But now what? This tutorial is going to take you on a strange and informative journey to show you how to create beautiful and vibrant textures on our feathered little friend here using the incredibly powerful Substance Painter. No pesky hand painting involved, just pure stylized PBR magic using creative techniques and easy foundational basics. You're going to walk away with a ton of confidence and ammunition to texture all of your future projects on your own. Now, let's get started. Due to the very fortunate lack of live roosters in my apartment, I was forced to resort to Google Images to collect ideas for how roosters actually look, because as a city boy, I have never actually thankfully seen one of these demonic hellspawns in person. One piece of advice, be very careful with your choice of words when collecting your reference images. Now, as it turns out, roosters aren't these stinking piles of feather and garbage that I expected them to be. Roosters can be quite regal and are packed with vibrant and beautiful colors. Perfect for a person like me with too much time on my hands and a subscription to an overpriced 3D texturing software. This does seem like a great opportunity for us to practice our PBR skills in Substance Painter. So after laughing at rooster memes all night and a good portion of my morning, I had a solid collection of reference images to begin my texturing project and a fresh new outlook on life. It's time to start texturing. After you've downloaded the model from the 3D coloring book, let's open up Substance Painter and get everything set up. Now, right off the bat, you may notice that the mesh is a little off, and that's because we haven't added the opacity map to the mix yet. To get this going, import the provided opacity map into your project. Once that's done, just add a new simple layer, turn off every channel except for the opacity channel, and then drag and drop that opacity map into the opacity slot. Now your feathers should look a lot better. So keep in mind, every layer after this needs to have the opacity channel turned off. If one layer has it on, the mesh will reappear and you'll have to waste hours searching for it, like I did. Don't suffer like I did. So to tackle this project, it's best to break this texture up into manageable chunks so we don't get overwhelmed. So I'd recommend starting this project by mentally breaking down the asset into individual parts. So for example, this model, and in this specific tutorial, we're going to break it up into the tail feathers, the back feathers, that weird red stuff.
I mean, what is that?
The feet, extra colors for the wing, the eyes, and the beak. Now, the last few that I mentioned are very simple, so I'm going to spend the bulk of our time covering the meat and potatoes, the feathers. Now, I want to start this off by saying this took me way longer than I thought it would. I spent a good portion of 2 days tweaking the colors just to get it perfect. So maybe that's a little pathetic, but remember, you're watching a video on YouTube teaching you how to make an imaginary rooster look pretty, so let's not be too judgmental. First things first, let's brush that Cheeto dust off your keyboard and create a folder to mask out the area we want the tail feathers to cover. Now, by applying a black mask to the folder that is going to contain the texture layers for the tail feathers, we can control exactly where we want the texture to appear. I decided that to maintain a consistent style, the tail feather texture was going to be used in several other areas of the body as well, namely the chest and one of the top portions of the wing. Also, because I'm lazy. So with that being said, use a combination of polygon fill, UV fill, and painting to build out the mask. If you get confused, you can always refer to the fully textured file I've provided to all 3D coloring book users as a reference. Now, once that's done, it's time to add our first fill layer, and it's going to be a base layer. So choose a nice deep blue color. Turn off every channel except for the color and roughness channel, and set the roughness channel all the way to 1. This is what we're going to be using for the rest of the tutorial. You now have a base. So this is a decent start, but it's important to make sure we have some color variation in that base to make sure that the texture doesn't fall too flat later on. So let's go ahead and add a second fill layer with only the color channel selected, and you can press the Alt-click button on the channel to make sure that that is the only channel selected. From there, let's add a black mask and add a fill. This fill layer is going to drive our color variation depending on the map that we choose. Now this is where we can get creative. You don't have to follow me exactly, so pick a grunge map that you like and drag and drop it onto your fill layer. You can always change this and experiment with it later. As you can see now, the fill layer is now populating your texture with only the grunge that you have specified. Pretty cool, right? So feel free to now change the color to something slightly lighter than your original blue base. Pick something that stands out to you. I'm not that creative, so I just went with a slightly lighter blue. Now, once that's done, it's time to add a blur slope filter above that fill layer you just made. This is a technique I use to give it that hand brush feel, and you can also combine this with another directional blur filter as well if you want to get really crazy with it. So feel free to mess around and experiment with it. Now, since we're using non-destructive techniques, you can rotate and scale that grunge map as you please to get the position and look that you want. If the color is too overpowering, feel free to drop the opacity of that layer a bit. I ended up dropping mine all the way down to about 23% opacity. Now let's go even further with it and add a second layer of color variation. So once that's done, press Ctrl D on that layer to duplicate it. And this time let's add a different map with almost a bright green and turquoise color. This will give your texture that burst of color and vibrancy. Feel free again to experiment with this layer to see what works for you. Now, the reason I'm recommending putting some green in there is taking a look at our references, we can see that we can definitely spare some room for some more green in there. Splashes of slightly different colors will really make your textures pop, so try to implement this as much as you can. For this project, we're going to try and bring in as much greens and violets as possible to add some of that really great color variation that goes so well with stylized art. Now, to continue on with that thought, let's add another green fill layer with only the color channel selected. Add a black mask and a mask editor generator. This time, we're going to use the curvature information of this model to add some more color variation. Now, once the generator is applied, pop open the curvature settings in there and tweak them until you get a look that you're satisfied with. Again, you can use the 3D coloring book as a reference to see how I set mine up. Ideally, I tried to set up the green so that it's only really messing with the feathers closest to the body of the rooster. Now, you can also add another blur slope filter if you're feeling artsy and you want to add some more of that hand brushed look. Okay, now for the fun part. Let's add some highlights to this texture to really sell that hand-painted vibe. We really want to make sure this looks like it was drawn by hand, so let's create another fill layer and add a black mask, and again, let's add another mask editor generator. So now here's the trick. In the curvature settings drop-down, make sure that everything is completely turned off except for the fine and the sharp settings. Pull those bad boys all the way to 1. This way, only the micro details are getting picked up and only the edges and small details will become highlighted. Now choose a nice light blue color as the highlight, and then feel free to take a second to look back and appreciate how good you've become at texturing useless farm animals. Now that we've created a nice, vibrant base layer and texture, let's start adding some depth to this. Now you can do this in a few ways, but a simple dark violet fill layer with a curvature generator will do just the trick. Mess with the larger curvature settings to get the violet to fill in the darker parts of the texture. You could also, if you wanted, try this with ambient occlusion generators as well, whatever floats your boat. Now, you may have noticed this doesn't really look a lot like the final result, and that's because we still have one final layer to add with my favorite filter, and one of the main tricks everyone should know when using Substance Painter, and that's adding your baked lighting to the texture. Now, this is an extremely powerful filter that will simulate lighting information right onto your albedo texture, adding some beautiful color variation and depth. I highly recommend trying to use this on every single asset you work with in the future. And the more you practice with it, the better you will get. You will thank me later. So to do this, just create a new fill layer with only the color channel selected. And instead of adding a black mask this time, just right click and add a filter. You can now select the baked stylized lighting filter and add it to your layer. Then make sure to switch your blending mode to soft light. And just like that, in a few layers, we've now got a pretty fantastic looking texture. So if you've made it this far, give yourself a huge pat on the back, and you've already made a beautiful PBR texture with basically a small amount of effort. But we have a long way to go to turn this regal rooster into the belle of the ball. Now, if you're ready to finish this model up, learn a few weird facts about roosters, and learn a few more tricks and secrets of Substance Painter along the way, let's get going. Now that the YouTube viewers are gone and it's just us, it's time to tackle those beautiful vibrant feathers that cover the body of the rooster. I chose a nice orange as a contrast to the violet and blue tail feathers. So first things first, let's mask out the area that is going to be covered by the orange feathers. I don't really have to show this process again, but just to recap, create a folder and then add a black mask to the folder and slowly start masking out the areas using the UV select and the paintbrush as well. So for our base color, let's start off by choosing a nice bright orange as the base. Now just remember to turn the roughness all the way to 1 and to make sure that only the color and roughness channel are selected. Now once the base layer is done, in our next layer, we want to try and draw the viewer's eye to the head of the rooster. So to do that, we can use a gradient. So let's create a yellow gradient moving up into the head of the rooster. On smaller texture areas, it's good to increase the contrast to have a more dramatic gradient. Now for the next 2 layers, we're going to be creating curvature masks to add some highlights and color variation to the feathers. So just like we did in the tail feathers, create a yellow and orange base layer, add a black mask and a mask editor generator, and start playing with the sides of the highlights in the curvature settings. Try and make the first layer take care of the larger details, and then in your second layer, you can make your color a little lighter and more saturated and only focus on the more precise curves. This is going to create a layered effect that will add more depth to your texture. For the next layer, I noticed the chest area was looking a little flat color-wise, so I created another fill layer with a black mask and used the light generator to add a bright splash of yellow to the chest of the rooster. Feel free to play with the lighting angles to get it just right. I ended up dropping the opacity to around 0.6. Now at this point, you could consider it to be mostly done, but to take it a step further, let's add a more prominent gradient to the bottom to really sell the color. So I added a bright red gradient moving down into the body of our rooster to add some more color variation to the mix. This texture was really missing some red, so don't be shy when it comes to setting up the gradient on this one. To do that, as a recap, let's add a new layer, a black mask, add a position generator, and set the red to start at the bottom of that orange back feathers, and then fade to the point just about where your top gradient starts, around 3/4 up the neck. Now to finalize this part of the texture, one more time, let's add some baked lighting just to bring it home, just like we did with the final layer of the tail feathers. I normally dial back the opacity a bit, but I think it looked really striking with the default setup, so I left it alone. Again, just to recap, create a brand new layer, make sure everything's turned off except the color channel, and then this time just right click and add the filter, the baked stylized lighting filter, and you are good to go. Okay, next texture. As usual, let's create a folder and begin to mask out the next texture. We're going to be focusing on the comb and wattle. Yes, that is what they're actually called. Looking back at our references, I also noticed that this red texture carries over into a good portion of the face. So make sure to switch to a paintbrush and paint over a blotch of area around the eye. I recommend experimenting with shapes until you find something you like. There's no correct answer here. Now that the area is properly masked out and we have our base color, let's just add a new layer add a black mask, and then add a curvature generator. We're going to use the color picker to get a slightly less saturated color than your base, and let's tweak the curvature settings so you get just the top edges nice and highlighted. Remember to make sure everything is turned off except roughness to 1 and your color channel. Now let's add some depth and shadows with 2 new layers, an ambient occlusion layer and a dirt pass. I often like to pair these together to add a great layered shadowed effect. So in the first new layer, just create a black mask and then go ahead and add an ambient occlusion generator and invert the generator. That's very important. Now select a nice black color for that ambient occlusion and then make sure you change the blending mode to multiply. So for the dirt pass, let's duplicate the previous layer. So highlight the previous layer and press Ctrl D. And now all you have to do is go over to the generator part of that layer and switch that from ambient occlusion to dirt. Now you can tweak those dirt settings until you find a level you like. This is supposed to be inspired by hand painting, so I wouldn't go too overboard with this. Great, so now that we've got some depth in the shadows, let's add a gradient pointing to the top with a bit of orange to add some color variation. Remember to increase the contrast settings in the position generator to obtain a more dramatic effect. So go ahead, add a new layer, add a black mask, and then choose the position generator. And then with the color, go ahead and choose a nice orangey red color, slightly brighter and slightly more vibrant than your base red. Now this is looking pretty good so far, but the colors are still a little flat. So as the final layer, let's add that baked lighting layer as the cherry on top to really sell the look. At this point now, you guys know exactly how to make it. So go ahead and do that and experiment with it a little. Now, we've got some cool colors in here. You can see our feathered friend's starting to look pretty handsome. It's pretty cute, dude. Now, once the comb and wattle are finished, let's bring our attention to the feet. This can be easily done in 3 simple layers using the strategies that you've now learned from your previous textures. First things first, let's make sure to create a new folder for this texture and mask out the area. This should be very, very quick. Now, once that's done, add a darker orange as a base color as your first layer. Now that that's done, let's add a dirt pass using a dirt generator, just like we did with our previous texture. And this time try to use a dark violet to fill the crevices to blend and contrast with the orange base layer. Creating contrasts are super important, especially with stylized art when it leans so heavily on creating vibrant and beautiful colors. Finally, let's add some baked lighting to top it all off, but this time I'm going to give you a great tip. So let's create our new layer and change the blend mode to soft light and then add our baked lighting filter. So this looks pretty good, but we can take it one step further because this doesn't exactly look hand painted to me. Right click on the layer and add a blur slope filter. And there you go, you have easy hand painted lighting with just a single layer, and you can thank me later for that one. So for the wings, now since you already know how feathers are done, I'm going to save us some time in this tutorial and let you use what you've learned on the tail feathers to mask out and color and texture the wing. So feel free to copy that color scheme that I used, and feel free to take a look at the reference file that I've provided to see exactly how I've done it. However, the process is the exact same as the tail feathers, the exact same. The blue in the middle is just the tail feathers mask painted into that area. And for the red and brown, all I did was copy and pasted the tail feathers stack into red and brown masks and then simply tweak the base colors to get a nice red at the top of the wing and brown feathers for the tip of the wing just to break it up a little bit. Super easy. Well guys, it's been a fun ride, but I guess we're pretty much wrapping up here, and this is one of the last textures, one of 2 that we're going to work on, and it's incredibly simple. So let's create a brand new folder and let's mask out the beak. Looking at our references, you can see that sometimes roosters have that white dot on their side of the face as well, so feel free to paint that out as well. The color is close enough that we can just use this texture to paint that as well. Now the beak only consists of 2 layers. So first, choose a bone colored base layer and then go back to your foot texture and then duplicate that hand painted lighting texture that I showed you with the filters and then just simply plop it on top of the base layer. and you're pretty much done at that point. Reusing layers is such a crucial part of texturing and 3D art in general, and will save you a ton of time in the future. So when you pick up really cool tips and tricks like this, be sure to save them as smart materials or mentally save them so you can use them and reuse them for later. Eventually, you'll be saving hours and hours on your workflow. And for the cherry on top, let's finally add some lifeless eyes to our pal, because roosters are soulless demons. Now, once you have a new folder masked out, add a base layer with a slight red hue to it. A pure white will work too, but you'll see why I prefer the red in a second. Next, create a basic layer on top of that, not a fill layer, and use the circular hard brush with a black base color and drop a single pupil onto the eye mesh, and you've got your pupil just like that. Now mess around with the position if you want. I made his eyes point more outwards instead of straight forwards because it kind of gave him that dopey look instead of a more intent looking forward. Now for the final touch, to add some artificial shine to your eyeball. Now select a pure white base color using the same layer. Change the brush to a soft basic brush so the edges aren't hard, the edges fade out a bit, and just drip a single stroke up into that top corner of the pupil. So halfway in the pupil and halfway in the rest of the eye. This is to simulate light shining off the eyeball. Now you see why it's important to make sure that the eyeball is a slight shade of red, just so that the shine pops out a little more. And once the eyeball is done, this texture is finally complete, and we've completed a full PBR hand-painted style rooster with pretty basic instructions and some pretty simple layers. I really hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I had a lot of fun making it. I put a lot of extra effort into it. Got a new microphone, got a new editing software. So I'm gonna be making tutorials that are much higher quality moving forward. Please let me know what you think of the tutorial, and I will see you guys in the next 3D coloring book workshop tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed. Take care.